This is a special report on NTD News. Good evening, I'm Kelly Wright from New York. Minutes from now, President Joe Biden will deliver an address to the nation from the White House. He is scheduled to speak at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In a rare Oval Office address, the president is reportedly expected to speak to the American people about his plan to ask Congress for nearly $100 billion to provide military assistance to Israel and Ukraine, two democratic allies that are embroiled in bloody conflicts in their countries. Part of the additional money includes funding for Taiwan and gaining control of the illegal immigration crisis along the U.S. southern border with Mexico. Now, the president's address comes just one day after completing an historic trip to Israel, where he told Israel Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli people that he fully supports the country's right to defend itself against Hamas. According to the Israeli government, the terror group killed more than 1,400 people during a surprise attack and took more than 200 hostages along the Israel border with Gaza. Mr. Biden also pledges humanitarian assistance for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And in the wake of Israel Defense Forces' swift and punishing counteroffensive. And as we await the president to speak at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, White House correspondent Iris Tao joins me now. And Iris, you're joining us from Washington. What is the president hoping to achieve with tonight's speech?
Good evening to you, Kelly. So as you just mentioned, President Biden just came back to the White House from Israel late last night, and in just a few minutes, he's about to give a speech to the whole nation, and he's going to directly make an appeal to the American public that the U.S. needs to not only back Israel, but also continue supporting Ukraine. So the White House told us that the president will focus on the message that supporting these countries is crucial to the U.S. national security interest, and he's also going to make a connection between what's happening in the world with the American people and what's happening in the U.S. So that is his main argument tonight. Meanwhile, as you just mentioned, it does come as the White House is expected to ask Congress for some $100 billion in aid, which reportedly was $60 billion going for Ukraine and some $40 billion going to Israel, Taiwan, and the southern border. So we do expect the president to make that appeal not only to the American public, but also especially to lawmakers in Congress. And we also have to know that this speech is very rare because this only marks the second time that President Biden has ever given a speech or an address to the nation from the Oval Office. The last time he did it was during the debt crisis. And tonight, when he's about to speak, we know that funding requests, and this specific funding request for Congress, will encounter pushback in Congress, especially over more support for Ukraine. The U.S. has already sent some $75 billion to Ukraine, and we have seen that the support for more aid for Ukraine has been waning, not just among the American public, according to polls, but also among especially Republican lawmakers in Congress. So it's a big question tonight about whether President Biden and how he will make that direct appeal to the American public, of course, and lawmakers.
And Iris, you were talking about the appeal that he has to make to lawmakers there on Capitol Hill. And of course, the world is watching, and the United States is very familiar with the fact that Congress is not operating on any unified plan. In fact, in the House, they're still having a problem voting for a Speaker of the House. So does the president expect Congress to be able to rally to his requests when they are having a difficult time getting themselves together?
So that same question was asked several times during White House press briefings last week and before President left for Israel. And the answer that the White House has been telling us is that there's broad bipartisan support for both aid to Ukraine and for both aid to Israel. So they do expect things like this to move forward rather smoothly. But as I just mentioned, there is growing opposition to more Ukraine aid. But now the administration, as we see now, is trying to tie Ukraine aid with aid to Israel and, of course, some funding for the border. So we do see that as a strategy that administration is trying to take to try to get more support, especially from some Republican lawmakers here.
Yeah, we're watching live right now on Capitol Hill, Iris, as we're speaking. Members in Congress, I'm sorry, that's not live. That's actually video from previous days where they were trying to vote on a Speaker of the House. Iris, let me ask you, the mood and the tone of the president's speech tonight, will it be, obviously will be sincere? He will have to be extremely convincing. And yesterday, when he spoke in Israel, many people looked at the president and said that he did the right thing in defending Israel. Some people question him in terms of providing $10 million or $10 million to help in the humanitarian aid in the Palestinian area. He drew some heat from that. Is he still getting that kind of criticism from people, even on Capitol Hill, who support the Palestinians?
That's for sure. So just today we heard Senator Rick Scott questioning that $100 million aid to Gaza and the West Bank, asking Hamas still have American hostages in hand and there's over 30 Americans killed by them. Why would we send aid to Gaza? But of course, President Biden has also tried to address that concern by saying that there will be inspections and measures in play to try to make sure that U.S. taxpayer dollars don't go into Hamas hands. But the big question is, can we actually prevent that? How do you ensure that on the ground and such? Of course, we know Gaza is controlled by Hamas. How do you ensure that none of the aid or medical supplies or fuel, food don't get into Hamas hands and become more resources for them? And that is the biggest question. And of course, like you mentioned, that is the biggest criticism President Biden is now facing over his handling of what's happening in the Middle East right now.
Iris, it's a very high-stakes game that the president has to play right now, a diplomatic dance that he's playing overseas in Israel, and also with what's going on in Ukraine. And then, of course, what's happening to the southern border. He's having to play a high-stakes game with his own country in terms of the members on Capitol Hill. Is there enough bipartisan support for any of those measures that the president is trying to convey to the American people tonight, and most notably to the members of Congress?
That's a great question. So we do know that there is broad support for more aid for Israel, both among the American public, according to polls, and also among members of Congress from both parties. But the question is, how much U.S. involvement should there be? Of course, we're all seeing what's happening in Israel, Israelis being killed and attacked by Hamas, of course, Americans involved. We're all sympathizing with that. But the question, for example, whether we should send U.S. troops, how much aid we should send remains a question. Actually, according to a new poll released today, a lot of Americans actually still remain skeptical of President Biden's handling of what's going on in the Middle East. So when it comes to support on Capitol Hill, really has to, for example, when it comes to this specific package, a lot of lawmakers are saying that they have to see how much solid support for, let's say, Israel, Taiwan, and how much funding for border there will actually be in this package in order for them to decide whether they will sign on to this broad and, of course, gigantic package, including so much aid to Ukraine. Kelly.
Yeah, Iris, stand by. Iris Tao, our White House correspondent for NTD News. Appreciate you so much. Stand by with us as we bring in another guest now, Rabbi Abraham Cooper. Rabbi Cooper is the Associate Dean for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Rabbi, it's good of you to join us. We were just talking to Iris about the president. Of course, he's expected to speak at 8 o'clock. That's about a minute from now, according to my time, 8 p.m. Eastern. What do you think the president has to convey to the American people in terms of giving full support, in terms of Congress giving full support to the financial needs that Israel will have to further its military defense against Hamas terrorism?
He has a very tough road to follow, because you've got Ukraine, you've got the border issue, you have Israel. Each of them are very, very serious. I think he wants to try to ride the positive feelings that have come as a result of his historic visit to Israel in a time of war, to indicate to the American people that he's on top of things, and he wants them to look holistically at the needs, as he sees it, of the United States from their foreign policy point of view, and try to tie up the Ukraine and Israeli needs into one package. I think a lot is riding on the speech.
Indeed, and Rabbi Cooper, his visit to Israel yesterday was very historic. The President of the United States traveling to a war zone, albeit Israel is our strongest ally in the Middle East. What was your feeling or your take on his speech there and his meeting with Bibi Netanyahu?
I think the Israeli people and most Jews saw it as a collective hug for the people of Israel. This isn't just another war. A group of terrorists who went and mass murdered, raped, kidnapped over 1,000 people, did horrible things to dozens of babies. The kind of barbaric, evil behavior we thought was a long, long time ago. And the fact also that over 20 Americans have been murdered and countless others are still held hostage. It is a bold move that he made. I think he showed kind of empathy for the people of Israel that they will long remember. Whether that translates into a victory with Congress, a very fractured, political discourse that we have in America, that remains to be seen. It's a bold attempt, but it does also send a signal to the American people that when it comes to these issues in foreign policy, at least, he knows what he's doing. His administration knows what it's doing and standing on the right
All
side
right,
of it.
Rabbi, I've got to interrupt you now. The President of the United States is now speaking, giving that important address from the Oval Office. Let's watch the President of the United States, President
The Prime Minister and members of his
Joe
cabinet.
Biden.
And most movingly, I met with Israelis who had personally lived through horrific horror of the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October. More than 1,300 people slaughtered in Israel, including at least 32 American citizens. Scores of innocents, from infants to the elderly grandparents, Israelis, Americans taken hostage. As I told the families of Americans being held captive by Hamas, we're pursuing every avenue to bring their loved ones home. As president, there is no higher priority for me than the safety of Americans held hostage. The terrorist group Hamas unleashed pure, unadulterated evil in the world. But sadly, the Jewish people know perhaps better than anyone that there is no limit to the depravity of people when they want to inflict pain on others. In Israel, I saw people who are strong, determined, resilient, and also angry, in shock and in deep, deep pain. I also spoke with President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and reiterated that the United States remains committed to the Palestinian people's right to dignity and to self-determination. The actions of Hamas terrorists don't take that right away. Like so many other, I'm heartbroken by the tragic loss of Palestinian life, including the explosion at the hospital in Gaza, which was not done by the Israelis. We mourn every innocent life lost. We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity. You know, the assault on Israel echoes nearly 20 months of war, tragedy, and brutality inflicted on the people of Ukraine, people that were very badly hurt since Putin launched his all-out invasion. We've not forgotten the mass graves, the bodies found bearing signs of torture, rape used as a weapon by the Russians, and thousands of Ukrainian children forcibly taken into Russia, stolen from their parents. It's sick. Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it. Hamas' stated purpose for existing is the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, and innocent Palestinian families are suffering greatly because of them. Meanwhile, Putin denies Ukraine has or ever had real statehood. He claims the Soviet Union created Ukraine. And just 2 weeks ago, he told the world that if the United States and our allies withdraw, and if the United States withdraw, our allies will as well, military support for Ukraine would have, quote, a week left to live, but we're not withdrawing. I know these conflicts can seem far away, and it's natural to ask, why does this matter to America? So let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising. So if we don't stop Putin's appetite for power and control in Ukraine, he won't limit himself just to Ukraine. Putin's already threatened to remind, quote, remind Poland that their Western land was a gift from Russia. One of his top advisors, a former president of Russia, has called Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania Russia's Baltic provinces. These are all NATO allies. For 75 years, NATO has kept peace in Europe and has been the cornerstone of American security. And if Putin attacks a NATO ally, we will defend every inch of NATO which the treaty requires and calls for. We'll have something that we do not seek. Make it clear, we do not seek. We do not seek to have American troops fighting in Russia or fighting against Russia. Beyond Europe, we know that our allies, and maybe most importantly our adversaries and competitors, are watching. They're watching our response in Ukraine as well. And if we walk away and let Putin erase Ukraine's independence, would-be aggressors around the world would be emboldened to try the same. The risk of conflict and chaos could spread in other parts of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, especially in the Middle East. Iran is supporting Russia in Ukraine, and it's supporting Hamas and other terrorist groups in the region, and will continue to hold them accountable, I might add. The United States and our partners across the region are working to build a better future for the Middle East. One where the Middle East is more stable, better connected to its neighbors, and through innovative projects like the India-Middle East-Europe Rail Corridor that I announced this year at the summit of the world's biggest economies. More predictable markets, more employment, less rage, less grievances, less war when connected. It benefits the people, it would benefit the people of the Middle East, and would benefit us. American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk, if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs, to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine. Is a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. Help us keep American troops out of harm's way. Help us build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more prosperous for our children and grandchildren. In Israel, we must make sure that they have what they need to protect their people today and always. The security package I'm sending to Congress and asking Congress to do is an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security that will sharpen Israel's qualitative military edge, which we've committed to, the qualitative military edge. We're going to make sure Iron Dome continues to guard the skies over Israel. We're going to make sure other hostile actors in the region know that Israel is stronger than ever and prevent this conflict from spreading. Look, at the same time, President Netanyahu and I discussed again yesterday the critical need for Israel to operate by the laws of war. That means protecting civilians in combat as best as they can. The people of Gaza urgently need food, water, and medicine. Yesterday, in discussions with the leaders of Israel and Egypt, I secured an agreement for the first shipment of humanitarian assistance from the United Nations to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. If Hamas does not divert or steal these shipments, we're going to provide an opening for sustained delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance for the Palestinians. As I said in Israel, as hard as it is, we cannot give up on peace. We cannot give up on a two-state solution. Israel and Palestinians equally deserve to live in safety, dignity, and peace. You know, and here at home, we have to be honest with ourselves. In recent years, too much hate has given too much oxygen, fueling racism, the rise of anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, right here in America. It's also intensified in the wake of recent events that led to the horrific threats and attacks that both shock us and break our hearts. On October 7th, terror attacks have triggered deep scars and terrible memories in the Jewish community. Today, Jewish families worried about being targeted in school, wearing symbols of their faith, walking down the street, or going out about their daily lives. You know, I know many of you in the Muslim American community, the Arab American community, the Palestinian American community, and so many others are outraged and hurting, saying to yourselves, here we go again with Islamophobia and distrust we saw after 9/11. Just last week, a mother was brutally stabbed. A little boy, here in the United States, a little boy who just turned 6 years old was murdered in their home outside of Chicago. His name was Wadiha, a proud American, a proud Palestinian American family. We can't stand by and stand silent when this happens. We must, without equivocation, denounce anti-Semitism. We must also, without equivocation, denounce Islamophobia. And to all you hurting, those of you hurting, I want you to know I see you. You belong. And I want to say this to you. You're all America. You're all American. This is in a moment, in moments like these, when fear and suspicion, anger and rage run hard, that we have to work harder than ever to hold on to the values that make us who we are. We're a nation of religious freedom, freedom of expression. We all have a right to debate and disagree without fear of being targeted in schools or workplaces or in our communities. We must renounce violence and vitriol. See each other not as enemies, but as fellow Americans. When I was in Israel yesterday, I said that when America experienced the hell of 9/11, we felt enraged as well. While we sought and got justice, we made mistakes. So I cautioned the government of Israel not to be blinded by rage. And here in America, let us not forget who we are. We reject all forms of hate, whether against Muslims, Jews, or anyone. That's what great nations do, and we are a great nation. On Ukraine, I'm asking Congress to make sure we can continue to send Ukraine the weapons they need to defend themselves and their country without interruption, so Ukraine can stop Putin's brutality in Ukraine. They are succeeding. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he thought he would take Kyiv and all of Ukraine in a matter of days. Well, over a year later, Putin has failed, and he continues to fail. Kyiv still stands because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine has regained more than 50% of the territory Russian troops once occupied, backed by U.S.-led coalition of more than 50 countries around the world, all doing its part to support Kyiv. What would happen if we walked away? We are the essential nation. Meanwhile, Putin has turned to Iran and North Korea to buy attack drones and ammunition to terrorize Ukrainian cities and people. From the outset, I've said, I will not send American troops to fight in Ukraine. All Ukraine is asking for is help, for the weapons, munitions, the capacity, the capability to push invading Russian forces off their land, and the air defense systems to shoot down Russian missiles before they destroy Ukrainian cities. Let me be clear about something. We send Ukrainian equipment sitting in our stockpiles. And when we use the money allocated by Congress, we use it to replenish our own stores, our own stockpiles, with new equipment. Equipment that defends America and is made in America. Patriot missiles for air defense batteries, made in Arizona. Artillery shells manufactured in 12 states across the country, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, and so much more. You know, just as in World War II, today patriotic American workers are building the arsenal of democracy and serving the cause of freedom. Let me close with this. Earlier this year, I boarded Air Force One for a secret flight to Poland. There I boarded a train with blacked out windows for a 10-hour ride each way to Kyiv, to stand with the people of Ukraine ahead of the one-year anniversary of their brave fight against Putin. I'm told I was the first American to enter a war zone not controlled by the United States military since President Lincoln. With me was just a small group of security personnel and a few advisors. But when I exited that train and met President Zelensky, I didn't feel alone. I was bringing with me the idea of America, the promise of America, to the people who are today fighting for the same things we fought for 250 years ago: freedom, independence, self-determination. And as I walked through Kyiv with President Zelensky, with air raid sirens sounding in the distance, I felt something I've always believed. more strongly than ever before. America is a beacon to the world. Still. Where, as my friend Madeleine Albright said, the indispensable nation. Tonight, there are innocent people all over the world who hope because of us, who believe in a better life because of us, who are desperate not to be forgotten by us, and are waiting for us. But time is of the essence. I know we have our divisions at home. We have to get past them. We can't let petty, partisan, angry politics get in the way of our responsibilities as a great nation. We cannot and will not let terrorists like Hamas and tyrants like Putin win. I refuse to let that happen. In moments like these, we have to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. The United States of America. And there is nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together. My fellow Americans, thank you for your time. May God bless you all, and may God protect our troops.
And that, of course, is President Joe Biden speaking from the Oval Office, a rare speech. He was talking about reaching out to Congress to present a package to them, a funding package for the defense systems that Israel is currently using in its fight against Hamas and other terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East. He also talked about reaching out to get more funding to help Ukraine. And the President of the United States also stating that America is a beacon of hope, that America is still that shining city on a hill that many people are looking for. He talked about the exportation of American values is helping to hold the world together. The president says we cannot forget the 20 months of war in Ukraine, and stated that strong, determined, and angry is what he saw within the Israeli government and the people, and also cautioned Israel yesterday during his historic visit there that because of their anger, they cannot do what America did when we had our own 9/11 and making mistakes because of our anger. And the president stated that he would go on to pledge support for the Palestinians in terms of humanitarian aid, speaking about that he reached a deal between, or an agreement, I should say, between Egypt and Israel to allow the first set of humanitarian trucks to enter into the Gaza Strip area to provide much needed humanitarian relief. And we have Iris Tao with us, who is White House correspondent. She's been following the speech as well. Iris, were there any surprises in this speech that you heard from the president? He was pretty much on point as we expected. Was there anything missing in this speech?
So first, I don't think there's anything surprising about this speech. First, we heard Biden laying out why he's making this, quote, urgent budget request for Congress to fund both Israel and Ukraine. He called it a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for generations. He also explained why it's needed. For example, he says it's needed to build a world that's safer, more prosperous for children. And of course, it's also meant for ensuring our own national security, because he says dictators, if we don't stop them, they're going to keep going and, of course, create more troubles around the world. So that part's not surprising. And of course, also not surprising how he directly talked to lawmakers in Congress, saying that we have to get past partisan divisions, and we have to get to what's really important for our country. So we did hear him directly addressing partisan divisions over these issues, especially more aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, when it comes to what's missing, we have actually heard most of what he just said in his speeches throughout the past day in Israel. For example, he talked about his conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he told him about how much U.S. supports them, but also he said he cautioned Israel against being consumed by what they're feeling, whether it be the anger or the frustration over what Hamas is doing. He also said that, he talked to them about 9/11 and how the U.S. made mistakes, he said, and then he's saying how basically, you have to abide by a law of war in this conflict. So he did actually mention that already in Israel. And of course, like you you just mentioned, he's also touting, if not also repeating what he did while in the Middle East, and that is brokering a deal between, or an agreement between Egypt and Israel to allow more humanitarian aid to flow from Egypt into Gaza. So these are the main, what he would call, accomplishments from his trip, and we did hear him talking about that in the speech just now. But of course, it's more direct appeal to the American public and, of course, the American lawmakers now in Washington, now that he's back in D.C. His top priority now will be to get this funding request into the Congress and hopefully, like in his words, get something done.
Iris Tal reporting for us tonight, our White House correspondent. We appreciate you so much, Iris. We're going to bring in now Abraham Cooper. He is the Rabbi Abraham Cooper and Associate Dean for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Rabbi Cooper, you heard the president speak tonight. Were there any surprises to you? Were you pleased to hear his support for Israel? Were you concerned about his support also for providing humanitarian support to the Palestinian area in Gaza?
Well, of course, there's a lot to unpack in this speech. Some of the themes, as an American, I wish we would have heard earlier in this presidency. It really was a call to try to create some bipartisanship when it comes to key foreign policy questions at a point where it's the low ebb in American politics. So I think he made a very strong speech and touched on many important points. I would say a few of the following. There isn't anyone that I know in Israel who's against innocent civilians in Gaza having the opportunity to get the basics, food and water. There is a fundamental problem in that every aspect of life in the Gaza Strip right now is controlled by Hamas. And the question is, how do you deliver those goods directly into the mouths of the people who need it, as opposed into the pockets of Hamas and other corrupt actors? That's one issue. Secondly, Israel's defense forces don't need lectures about abiding by the laws of war. Israel abides by those rules, but she's not fighting right now against another state, at least not directly. The main enemy here is Iran, but Israel is dealing with a terrorist entity that has killed in one day the equivalent of 34,000 Americans. So the anger, I think, is a righteous anger, but you can be sure that Israel will be going after the murderers and the infrastructure of terrorism, and has tried and will continue to try to minimize the impact on innocent civilians there. But overall, and also as the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, the president touched on that concept of religious freedom as a core American value. It's not something we hear very much these days, and I welcome it. But there's a lot more to do from the White House and congressional leaders to see whether or not it's going to be one package or whether or not it has to be parsed out. I'll leave it to political pundits on that point.
Yeah, Rabbi, that of course is a mouthful, exactly. Kyle Scheidler joins us as well. He's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. Kyle, good of you to join us this hour. Very important hour for America, the American people, and members of Congress, and the President of the United States himself, the Commander-in-Chief, pointing out that he wants to get that much-needed funding for Israel as well as for Ukraine. You heard the president's speech. What's your response, especially with regard to dealing with Hamas as a terrorist group that has inflicted harm and pain on the Israeli people, committing a 9/11 styled attack on October 7th?
Well, frankly, I thought the president's speech was somewhat outrageous. He's essentially trying to smuggle more Ukraine aid, which is politically contentious, behind Israel aid, which is not as politically contentious. That's aid that Israel requires for this conflict with Hamas, primarily because the Biden administration has drained U.S. stockpiles that are kept in Israel, and which Israel has a right to access in matters of national security, as they would in a case like this. So those stockpiles are empty because the Biden administration has sent them to Ukraine. He is now smuggling Ukraine support in on the backs of dead Israelis to try and refill those stockpiles in Israel. So I find that outrageous to begin with. Secondly, when he comments about not responding in the way that the United States did after 9/11, what he is really telling them is do not expand this conflict beyond Gaza. Do not target Hezbollah, for example, despite the fact that Hezbollah's existence is making the entire strategic situation far more difficult for Israel. And he's definitely telling them do not target Iran, do not do anything to upset or cause problems for Iran, despite the fact that we know that Iran was deeply involved in this most recent attack, that it was planned at least a year ahead of time between Hamas and Iran in Beirut. So what he is telling them is do not change the strategic balance in the region. This is a disastrous thing for Israel to do if it should choose to follow along with Biden here. They absolutely need to reset the strategic situation in the region. They need to remind everyone in the region, both friend and enemy, that they are a strong horse. They are a capable nation. They can defend themselves by themselves. They can take Hamas. They can take Hezbollah if they need to. They can defend the Golan Heights from Syrian and Iranian-backed militias if they need to. They need to make very, very clear to the world that they can defend themselves by themselves. And President Biden tonight doing pretty much everything he can to urge them not to do that and to make them appear weak and needy and reliant upon the United States. And frankly, I think that's a mistake.
Kyle, follow-up question to what you're stating right there. Do you have any concerns at all that what's currently happening in Israel, knowing that Israel is surrounded by a lot of hostile neighbors, do you have any concerns about this spilling or escalating into a regional war, which would be extremely problematic for the peace ever being achieved in the Middle East?
Well, I think if we want to achieve peace in the Middle East, we need to remind the region of Israel's value in the region. We've seen the Biden administration attempt to undermine the Abraham Accords, which they began doing almost as soon as they got into office. We've seen them trying to force, for example, the Palestinian issue back into negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was very, very close to reaching an agreement with Israel until the Biden administration stuck their nose in and meddled with things. So I think that, again, Israel has to prove to would-be allies like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, to its neighbors like Egypt, like Jordan, that it can defend itself, that it will defend itself if need be, and that it can defeat their mutual enemy in Tehran, who is, we must remember, behind all of this.
Yeah, and Rabbi Cooper, let me bring you back in. You've been following all the details as it relates to what's happening in the Middle East. We heard the president speak tonight about what's happening here in America in terms of being divided over faith and over race and how it's hurting the fabric of America, leading to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Your concerns about that, and did the president address it with the right type of tone in order to, for example, try to quell the kind of protests that we have seen on our college campuses, bringing so much tension, where you have people who are pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, even supporting Hamas and its activities and actions in Israel. What say you about what we're seeing on our college campuses and the divisiveness that we have in this country?
Right. Well, the president certainly had the right tone, I think, throughout most of the speech, but you're exactly correct. The biggest problem that American Jewry has right now is that we are witnessing the absorption and adoption and promotion of the Hamas narrative on America's elite campuses, in many cases led by Palestinian Americans who are essentially, and you see also Palestinians in London, riots in Berlin, in which basically these are pro-Hamas rioters and people who are basically saying, no, Israel basically doesn't have the right to exist, and therefore whoever is going to take them out, they have a moral blank check to do whatever they want, raping of women, dismembering of babies, etc. Things we never thought we would see again or hear again at this point. The United States of America and our administration have been struggling mightily to deal with the spike in anti-Semitism in our country. They've been less successful and frankly tried to deflect attention away from this element of Jew hatred, which is effectively using the language and the tactics of a terrorist organization. As one reporter told me, interviewed me from Europe, she said, I'm very sympathetic to the Palestinians, but I didn't sign on for what I saw they did on October 7th. And I think that Palestinian people in the Middle East, as well as those fellow citizens here, are doing no favor to their cause by going in the streets, by trying to intimidate Jewish students and faculty on the nation's leading campuses, as, by the way, the university presidents who were so outspoken on other issues, including Black Lives Matter, Ukraine, are basically silent as this kind of rhetoric infects the mainstream of American education, American culture, and it's something that we will, faith leaders and others, will have to deal with in a direct and straight way. You cannot, the commitment to human rights is not a multiple choice question. You're either committed that way or you're not. And the same goes for the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, indeed. And at the same time, the president did speak about the fact that a 6-year-old child, a Palestinian-American family, 6-year-old child losing his life as that family had actually prayed for peace and stated to their landlord that they were praying for peace. And the man who was accused of stabbing that child to death basically stating that he was against them because of their faith and their religion. America, in order to move forward, as the president stated, to show its American value and hold the glue of the world together, we cannot afford to fall into that abyss of hating each other based on our ethnicities and our faith. Kyle, would you agree to that, or is there? I'm sorry, Rabbi. Go ahead, Rabbi.
I just want to say I agree completely. I wish, though, the president would bring in all of the presidents of the elite universities and give them a bit of a dressing down. They get somewhere between a D and an F. Faith leaders across the board, we have our obligations as well. Our hearts go out to a family, in this case, an Arab American family, as well as so many other families across America who have absolutely no control of what goes on thousands of miles away and often are the brunt of hate, violence, and terrorism. What the key thing that we see right now that is so troubling in the U.S. and around the world is the adoption of the Hamas game book, their language and narrative, in terms of pursuing a Palestinian future. No Israeli government, left, right, or center, no country in the world would ever allow for that kind of a rhetoric. If that does, God forbid, ever reach the point that that represents everyone in the Palestinian community, you heard it from the president. He was there. He understands that. And we hope that the majority of Palestinians don't want to go down that road. But if you're looking at the sound bites and the clips from around the world, we're hearing that rhetoric now across the street and around the world. And we're very, very concerned, as is Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas, who spoke to Jewish leaders. I was there the other day in Washington, who cautioned about the possibility of individuals, lone wolves attacking our communities. So this is a very pivotal moment. I give the president high grades for the right tone, but if we're going to defeat the hate, we have to be honest about all sources of where it comes from.
Kyle, let me turn the attention to you right now in terms of the counterterrorism aspects. As we just heard the rabbi talk about what we have to do to actually protect ourselves, even from lone wolves and the spread of terrorism to this country. The president did not mention in his speech, and it was anticipated or reported that he would have likely talked about the southern border of the United States and Mexico. It's very porous, and there's been growing reports that some of the people coming across that border are bad actors. What have you heard?
Well, that's certainly the case. I mean, we know that hundreds of individuals on the terrorism watch list have been identified crossing the southern border in recent years, and many, many thousands more coming from countries of terrorism concern, including Iran, for example. But the reality is that we already have inside the United States networks of terrorism supporters, networks of groups which engage in material support for terrorism, both financial and propaganda. They are active on, frankly, every American college campus. That is why we are seeing the movements against Israel. We are seeing the vile anti-Semitism that's spewing out on all of these college campuses. Those are being directed by organizations which have direct links to known Palestinian terror groups, including Hamas and the PFLP, among others. And the Biden administration has done very, very little about that. In fact, there was a period where the Biden administration worked very hard to try to put the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is an organization with links to Hamas, on its committee to discuss anti-Semitism. So the Biden administration has been absolutely absent when it comes to dealing with jihadist terrorism, both at the southern border and inside our nation's borders.
I'm listening to you, Kyle, and I was listening to my control room give me some direction. I want to drill down a little bit more. If I hear you correctly, Kyle, you're stating that America needs to make a stronger stance in terms of protecting our homeland security as it relates to the southern border, as well as any potential terrorist group coming into this country and even abroad. That would also include our neighbors in Israel. So to that end, getting back to what the president talked about and the fact that he's going to be reaching out to Congress to get the funding that Israel needs, for example, to shore up its defenses in terms of the Iron Dome. From that perspective, I know you disagree with many of the things that President Biden has stated, Kyle, but from that perspective, is Israel in need of more materiel as well as funding for it, as well as more help, even from U.S. troops supporting in some sort of way from a support standpoint, bearing in mind that there are 2 carrier groups from our U.S. Navy already in the region?
Well, I think it's important that we make clear that Israel does not need the support of U.S. troops. They do not need the support of U.S. naval aircraft carriers off the coast. They do need support when it comes to material. They need the refilling of those stockpiles, which they're supposed to have access to and which the Biden administration has drained. So absolutely, the United States does need to meet its commitments to Israel to provide it with the material that it needs. It needs help refilling the Iron Dome. They are being continuously pounded with rockets from Hamas. If Hezbollah gets into the fight, there will be even more missiles and far more severe missile barrages. And so, yes, absolutely, the United States does need to take action to meet those obligations that it has to Israel. But that should not be confused with interfering with Israel's right to defend itself or projecting ourselves into the way. Israel has to be seen in the region as defending itself successfully by itself. We can meet our obligations, but we don't want to make it look as though the Israelis are totally reliant upon the United States, that they are incapable of defending themselves. That would be a very bad signal to send to the region. So we need to make a distinction between an Israel that can defend itself and will defend itself, and the U.S. playing its proper role, meeting its regular obligations, being a good ally.
Rabbi Cooper, I know you've got to go. Before you go, have a minute of your time to share with me what your thoughts are in terms of the hope that you have for America in forging this way forward for Israel, Ukraine, and even coming against the forces of evil that would come against good people on October 7th and destroying their lives without any provocation, but surely because they wanted to annihilate Jewish people.
Well, again, we never want to think about it, but imagine if the United States either was not on the world stage or simply left the world stage. If we left it to the likes of these tyrants, we didn't speak very much about Iran, but they're the main player. I understand there may have been some missiles sent up from Yemen, intercepted by U.S. forces, and it was en route to Israeli territory. I think the U.S. is there primarily to try to signal Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets facing Israel. Imagine in Israel without an Iron Dome. They already knocked out over 7,000 missiles just from Hamas, but 150,000 additional missiles from coming in from the north would be an absolute disaster. And Israel would have no choice but to go hard at Hezbollah, hurt Lebanon, which it doesn't want to do, and perhaps even take on Iran. So thank God there is the United States of America. It's certainly not a perfect place, but it's the greatest democracy and greatest country in the world. And just think for a moment, if God forbid it wasn't around and it was left to these horrific evil players, what kind of world we'd be living in. I just wish that a lot of the things that the president spoke about tonight and is taking action about tomorrow would have taken place a year or two before, and that we would have recognized Iran and the Iranian regime for the pernicious evil that it is against its own people and the threat that it poses to our allies like Israel and Egypt and others, UAE, as well ultimately to the United States. So I think this is a time, I hope, that bipartisanship will take place in Congress, maybe not the entire package, but the basic message that the president touched on tonight has been touched on by numerous previous presidents. If he matches action with that rhetoric, I think the world could be safer.
Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Associate Dean for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I appreciate you being with us at this hour, this important hour in America and the world, since the world is watching what the president had to say this evening. I appreciate you again on coming on our special report of the president speaking from the Oval Office. No, you have to run. In the meantime, Kyle Scheider is going to be staying in with us. We want to take a moment right now to reflect on the president of the United States and what he had to say. We're going to show you an excerpt of some of the speech that he gave this evening, where he called on Congress and stated that he would be sending Congress a package to actually get the funding to help support Israel and Ukraine. Let's listen to the president.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We're facing an inflection point in history. One of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come. That's what I'd like to talk with you about tonight. You know, early this morning I returned from Israel. They tell me I'm the first American president to travel there during the war. I met with the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet. And most movingly, I met with Israelis who had personally lived through horrific horror of the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October. More than 1,300 people slaughtered in Israel, including at least 32 American citizens. Scores of innocents, from infants to the elderly grandparents. Israelis, Americans taken hostage. As I told the families of Americans being held captive by Hamas, we're pursuing every avenue to bring their loved ones home. As president, there is no higher priority for me than the safety of Americans held hostage. The terrorist group Hamas unleashed pure, unadulterated evil in the world. But sadly, the Jewish people know perhaps better than anyone that there is no limit to the depravity of people when they want to inflict pain on others. In Israel, I saw people who are strong, determined, resilient, and also angry, in shock and in deep, deep pain. I also spoke with President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and reiterated that the United States remains committed to the Palestinian people's right to dignity and to self-determination. The actions of Hamas terrorists don't take that right away. Like so many other, I'm heartbroken by the tragic loss of Palestinian life, including the explosion at the hospital in Gaza, which was not done by the Israelis. We mourn every innocent life lost. We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity. You know, the assault on Israel echoes nearly 20 months of war, tragedy, and brutality inflicted on the people of Ukraine, people that were very badly hurt since Putin launched his all-out invasion. We've not forgotten the mass graves, the bodies found bearing signs of torture, rape used as a weapon by the Russians, and thousands of Ukrainian children forcibly taken into Russia, stolen from their parents. It's sick.
Message to America. His message to America and message to Congress, most notably, as he talked about gaining more support for Ukraine as well as Israel. The president making tonight's speech from the Oval Office in a rare speech since he's been in office, and making it very clear of what he wants to do. We have guests joining us right now. We have Kyle Scheidler, who's been on standing by with us. He's with the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. Kyle has listened to the president's speech. He has commentary on what the president had to say in his analysis. The president also went on to talk about the fact that he wanted to do something for America. He felt that America should always be a beacon of hope, stating that America is the glue that holds the world together. And then speaking very specifically about what America is experiencing, the fallout of the October 7th attack, the Hamas attack on Israeli people there along the northern border of Gaza, when Hamas terrorists went into the villages and the kibbutzes and the towns, and as we've seen on so many visual images, slaughtering and massacring people in their homes, in their bomb shelters, breaking through Israeli defenses, and people questioning where were the Israeli Defense Forces at that time, going to a rave event where people were gathered for a music concert for peace and unity, and killing more than 265 people there. In total, we understand through the Israeli government that some 1,400 people were killed on what has now become their 9/11. And the president, during his visit to Israel yesterday, stated that Israel's 9/11 is 15 times more than what our 9/11 is here. Kyle Scheidler is standing by, and Kyle, I can talk on and on about the atrocities that we saw on October 7th. And it reminds many American people about what happened to the United States when we experienced our own 9/11, where more than 3,000 people perished. And then, of course, Israel launching a relentless counterattack, which is their right to do to defend themselves. But Kyle, I've got to ask you, based on what the president said tonight, what's your response to what he said? And does it resonate with you in terms of what he's trying to, as he states, achieve, and that's getting more funding for Israel as well as for
No, frankly, it doesn't
Ukraine?
resonate with me.
It doesn't? Tell me why.
Because you have a administration with the Biden administration is providing billions of dollars to Iran, which has done hostage deals with Iran, which delisted the Iranian terrorist ally in Yemen from the terrorism sanctions list. That organization attempted to fire 2 missiles at Israel earlier today. We saw, as soon as they got into office, the Biden administration delivered a considerable amount of money to the Gaza Strip. In order to do that, they had to issue a waiver to allow them to essentially transfer funds to Hamas. They know perfectly well that the humanitarian aid, which they are preparing for the Strip, will go to Hamas, that Hamas will do with it whatever it pleases. They have no plan for that. The Deputy National Security Advisor actually said as much in a press event earlier today. The Biden administration has done, since it took office, almost everything imaginable to fuel the events that we saw take place. They have undermined Israel. They have bolstered Iran. They have funded and supported the Lebanese armed forces, which have close ties to Hezbollah. They have made a responsibility for any of these things that they have done.
Kyle, let me ask you in a follow-up question to that. Where do you see the answer? Where do you see this going? And I should also mention that standing by is Jonathan Tobin, who's the editor-in-chief of Jewish News Syndicate. Jonathan, we're going to get you in just a moment, but I wanted to follow up with you, Kyle. What would be your suggestion to the Biden administration in terms of taking a more tough posture, if you will?
Well, first and foremost, they would have to give up their number one treasure, the most important thing for this administration in foreign policy, which has been the Iran deal. They seem to care about an Iran nuclear deal more than they care about anything else in the region. And they have done anything they could in their power to make that a possibility. They have to give up on that pipe dream. It is a utopian project that will not work. The Iranians have no interest in it. The Iranians are interested in dominating the region and destroying Israel, and we can see that from the events in recent days. So they would need to make a complete 180 in the region. Frankly, I think they should do a lot more to listen to what the Israelis are telling them about Iranian intentions in the region, and frankly, what also the Gulf Arab states would tell them about Iranian intentions in the region if the Biden administration were inclined to listen.
And Jonathan, let me bring you in here. To Kyle's point, we do know that Iran has publicly stated that they basically believe that there should be death to Israel and death to the great Satan, the United States. In terms of him talking about taking a tougher stand against Iran, there's also a nexus of adversaries that are in the region and watching it very closely. It isn't just Iran, it's North Korea, it's potentially Syria, it's Russia, and it's China, the CCP. So to Kyle's point, how did you view the president's speech? And should more have been said and should more be done?
Well, first, I think we have to make a dichotomy between the positive elements of the speech and the mistakes. The positive, as with a number of the president's statements since the October 7th attacks, he gets the empathy with Israel very well. He gets the language of solidarity very well. That's important. And it's gotten him into some hot water with the left wing of his party and progressives. And it's impossible to imagine, quite frankly, his Democratic predecessor, Barack Obama, using the same language, making the same kind of stand. That said, even within this speech, even if we were to ignore all, which we shouldn't, the appeasement of Iran, the payment, the way all of that enriched and empowered Iran, and thereby enriched and empowered Hamas and Hezbollah, and made the region much more dangerous, set in motion the series of events that led to October 7th. Even if we were to ignore all that and just make believe that history began on October 7th, his incessant statement, his almost reflexive belief that Hamas doesn't have support within the Palestinian people is untrue. Hamas is a broad movement. The reason why there hasn't been an election on the West Bank is because Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authorities, who I think, as I've told you before, is serving in the 19th year of the 4-year term to which he was elected, fears that Hamas would beat him. His willingness to basically give an aid package to Hamas under the guise of humanitarian aid is crazy. And it's another way for him to bow to his left wing and their rhetoric of moral equivalence between Israel and the terrorists. I can't let go also his political decision to try to conflate the Ukraine war with what's going on in the war against Israel. Now, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was brutal and illegal, but it's not the same thing as the Hamas war to destroy Israel, commit genocide against the Jewish people. It is about Russia trying to preserve its sphere of control over parts of Eastern Europe as part of the former Soviet Empire. And it's a war which is locked in a deadly stalemate. And, when we speak of the aid packages, he's right that Israel does need resupply of all the weapons that it is forced to buy from the United States because, the United States pressured it not to develop its own arms industry more. But as much as people complain, as they do, I think unfairly, about aid to Israel, since almost all of it is spent in the United States, it's really an aid package to the American arms industry. Ukraine got 150 billion last year. Israel got 3.8 billion. These two things are not the same thing. And the massive commitment to Ukraine, in a deadlock, unwinnable war. Israel's war against Hamas is very winnable. Just the question is Biden going to flash the green light, or is he going to try to hamstring the Israelis and force them not to win it? That's a very different thing.
Yeah, Jonathan, we're seeing what's going on in real time overseas in the Middle East as well as Ukraine. I'm going to get to another point with you, Jonathan, because we look at our own homeland, the United States. The president did not mention the southern border. He also mentioned something that was very important to talk about, and that's the fact that here in America, we are still very much divided over race and ethnicity and faith. He rightly pointed out that people are walking around with Islamophobia and also anti-Semitism. We have seen an uptick, a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts for a number of years now. We've seen anti-Asian acts. We've seen this going on. And the president could be using that as a bully pulpit, his Oval Office, to actually warn people and urge people and encourage people to do the right thing, and that is to get our own house in order so that we can stand in agreement with one another, finding that common ground to become the more perfect union. I've got to ask you about what he had to say when he focused on that and how important that is for Americans to get over their hang-ups and stop being less divided and more united.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think he really struck, as much as he sort of bowed toward the need for unity. Who has been more divisive than Joe Biden, who calls his political opponents fascists and demonizes them, treats everybody who disagrees with his policies as racists. He has a bad record on that because of his own hyperbole, which he cannot control. You're right also that America needs to protect its southern border. That should be a given. And that's something that Joe Biden hasn't just failed to do. He opened up. He basically ended law enforcement at the border. It's been a Biden surge of illegal immigration in the numbers of millions every year since he was elected. That's that's a stain on his record. But let me also say, in that it's really it's annoying and quite frankly disingenuous on his part to keep trying to make moral equivalence of all different things. All acts of intolerance are bad. Nobody wants any discrimination against Muslims or any other group. But there is no comparison in the statistics. The FBI statistics show that anti-Semitism far outweighs that of anti-Muslim, and quite frankly, raising the false flag of Islamophobia is usually just a way to silence criticism of radical Islamic groups in this country. That's not Islamophobia. That's holding people accountable for spreading hate.
Jonathan, I appreciate you sharing your comments being stated. Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of Jewish News Syndicate, and Kyle Scheidler, who's joined us. He's with Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. Certainly both of you have weighed in quite a bit about what the president had to say and unpacking that. I appreciate your candid responses and your honesty and transparency and your concerns, not only for America, but also for what's going on in Israel as well as Ukraine. And there's just so much. We are living in some perilous times, gentlemen. And one president's speech does not solve the times that we're living in, but certainly we, the people, must work hard and be true to our core that we do strive to be that better angel and bring that hope and also bring that resolve and resiliency. And if I hear you both correctly, you want the resolve. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. And I want to thank you for joining us here on NTD for our special report on NTD News. The president speaking from the Oval Office tonight, talking about Israel as well as discussing the Palestinian issue, the Jewish issue, and what's happening in Ukraine. We appreciate your time and we value your insight and your appreciation of NTD News. From all of us at NTD News, good night. God bless.